Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I've come to the Senate floor tonight to ring the alarm bells. We're in the most perilous moment, the biggest threat to our republic since the Civil War. President Trump is shredding our Constitution. Is it okay for mass federal agents to arrest people off the street because of their skin color or their accent? No way, not in a free America. Okay for the government to cancel research grants to compel universities as to what they can teach? No way, not in a free America. Okay to use power over broadcast licenses or power over mergers to compel television networks as to what they can put on the air? Not in a free America. Okay to weaponize the Department of Justice to go after perceived political opponents? James Comey, Letitia James, Adam Schiff, a member of the Senate? Hell no. Absolutely not. You know, we have a theory of justice here in our nation that is symbolized by those words above the pillars of the Supreme Court. It's carved into the facade. You walk out these doors to the right, you keep going, you're standing on the steps that lead up to the Senate, you're staring straight out at the front of the Supreme Court. And there, carved above those pillars, it says, equal justice under law. Equal justice under law. That's the vision here in America. Not unequal injustice, which is what the president is pursuing by taking the power of the government and going after individuals that he does not like or perceives to be political opponents. That's what you read about in authoritarian governments far away, and you go, that would never happen in the United States of America. But it is happening right here, right now, unequal injustice. And then we have government by gaslighting. President Trump wants us to believe that Portland, Oregon, in my home state, is full of chaos and riots because if he can say to the American people that there are riots, he can say there's a rebellion. And if there's a rebellion, he can use that to strengthen his authoritarian grip on our nation. Pretend there are riots, or even try to provoke violence and tighten his authoritarian grip. Well, Portlanders have responded a very interesting way. They're not taking the bait. They are demonstrating with joy and whimsy. You may well have seen some of the videos. A wedding held in the street, a joyful wedding outside the ICE building. A group of frogs, a squad of frogs in inflated suits. The unipiper on his unicycle with his bagpipes. All of this going on, including things like puppies for peace, or keep your puppy paws off Portland. Keep your paws off Portland. Or maybe you saw the women coming down and holding a pajamas and pastries party in the morning. Portland demonstrating with joy and whimsy because they want to make it clear to the world that what Trump is saying about there being violent protests or a rebellion in Portland is just not true. I must say, I was particularly struck by something that happened about a week ago. The federal agents, assumed members of the Federal Protective Service, came out of the ICE building and asked the protesters to back up. They wanted to move them several blocks away. I gather from the reports from Oregon Public Broadcasting, they moved them about 300 yards, about 3 blocks. And then they lined up that, and by they, I mean the federal agents across the street. There had been no conflict between the protesters, Nothing thrown, no violence, no fight to break up. The federal agents lined up, and on orders, they prepared an assault on the protesters. And they did so because they had standing behind them professional videographers. So on command, they threw down flashbangs, which sound like gunfire. On command, they put down tear gas, creating clouds of smoke. On command, they fired pepper balls. And they taped the whole thing to try to pretend that they were dispelling a riot. This is the first time I know of in the history of the United States of America the agents of the federal government staged a fake riot in order to try to compel the courts to say, yes, you can federalize the National Guard because there's a rebellion there in that city. Wow. That should disturb every single member of this Senate. It should disturb every single member of the House of Representatives down this hallway that's back here to my right. But even with that kind of provocation, Portlanders are saying, we will not take the bait. We are demonstrating with joy and whimsy. Frogs and dinosaurs dancing. You couldn't find a much happier place in the country than the area near the ICE building in Portland. In addition to sending federal agents to harass protesters, Trump has attempted to federalize the Oregon National Guard. And so when he attempted to do so, a suit was filed saying, wait, there is a law that controls that. And that law says that you can only federalize National Guard if there is a rebellion or if there is an invasion. Now, when these laws were written by our predecessors in this chamber and in the House of Representatives down the long hallway, they knew what an invasion looked like. It looked like a foreign country with ships or troops ready to assault the United States of America. They were here on our border. They were ready to attack. And federalizing the National Guard was a tool that former legislators said would be available with a foreign invasion. Well, clearly, nothing close to anything that could be conceived like that is happening in the state of Oregon, or in the state of California, or the state of Illinois. The second principle for federalizing the National Guard is called rebellion. And at the time that the legislative authors of that, what they had in mind was a significant group, not a couple individuals, but a group, well organized. How can you do a rebellion if you're not well organized? Well armed, with a mission of overthrowing the government. That's what a rebellion is. So among the inflated costumes and the women in doing their pajamas and pastries and the wedding and the unipiper on the unicycle, where do you find a large, organized, armed group with a mission of overthrowing the government? Not to be found. So the district court issued a ruling and said the presentation of facts by the government is, quote, untethered to the facts. Untethered. There's nothing resembling what the federal government has described. So not only did Trump and his team stage a fake riot, they also submitted fake facts about the disturbances outside the ICE building. And so the judge issued what's called a temporary restraining order. And essentially that would give the judge the time to take further testimony and carefully consider the circumstances before issuing a longer restraining order, a more permanent restraining order on the effort to federalize. And then President Trump and his bank of geniuses said, well, if we can't federalize the Oregon National Guard, we're going to send the agents from California and Texas who have already been federalized. Well, again, you can only use them if there is a rebellion or if there is an invasion. And if there's no rebellion or invasion to justify federalizing Oregon National Guard, then there's none to justify outsiders coming. So she issued a second temporary restraining order. Where we're at now is that a whole lot of court action is happening at a whole lot of levels. The first of all is she has to decide whether or not to dissolve those two temporary restraining orders in the light of early action by the Ninth Circuit panel of 3 judges. Those findings of the 3 judges are now being submitted with a request for a panel of 12 judges, a larger group. And this is a larger group of judges from the Ninth Circuit. This is a common practice when there's a very significant issue. I would say, colleagues, that when we're talking about deploying the U.S. military against peaceful protesters, that is a very big issue indeed. And so I hope that the Ninth Circuit will have a much broader consideration. So that's potential action. And then we have decisions from the Seventh Circuit in Illinois. And they have found, much like the district judge found, that there was not a rebellion or an invasion, but that decision is being appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has, in an extraordinary level, really unmatched in our history of our country, been issuing preliminary findings on what they call the shadow docket, meaning they haven't heard full arguments before the court, but they make an initial ruling. And they may make an initial ruling this week. They may make an initial ruling to support the Seventh Circuit, which said that you cannot send in the troops to Chicago, or they may go the opposite direction. They may copy what 2 of the 3 judges said in the district court in the Ninth Circuit. And to sum it up, that opinion is profoundly troubling, because what they basically said is there may be nothing going on there now, but let's look back 3 months ago when a couple dozen people were arrested. Less significant, a couple dozen people a few months ago, so maybe that shows there was a rebellion. And of course, those were kind of the host of interactions that the Portland police found well within their ability to handle, so certainly no justification, and certainly not a well-organized armed rebellion trying to overthrow the government. They also said, well, let's use a less challenging definition of rebellion. So they wanted to adjust what the word rebellion means. Well, words in the law have meaning. And when judges start saying, well, we don't really want to use that meaning, we'll use some other meaning, try to justify what Trump is doing, that's troubling. But the third thing that they said was there should be high deference to the President of the United States. Now, on national security issues, it is a tradition for us to give considerable deference to the President. In fact, there is at least one law I know of that says it right in the law, that the judgment and the evaluation will be based on the opinion of the President. It's written into the law. But not in Title 10 that governs the federalization of the National Guard. Not there. No, it sets a standard, a rebellion or an invasion. And when there is a standard, it is the role of the court to determine whether the facts fit the standard. Otherwise, the standard is meaningless. If you want to throw open the barn doors as wide as they could possibly be flung to send the military after peaceful protesters in the United States of America, then say it's just up to the president regardless of the facts on the ground. A regardless of the facts opinion, in my estimation, is untethered to the Constitution, untethered to the long tradition in America of understanding what freedom is. That assembly is a fundamental freedom for citizens of the United States of America. That the ability to protest and exercise your free speech is a fundamental freedom. Freedom that cannot be legitimately squashed under our Constitution because a president of the United States is untethered to the facts and wants to develop the authoritarian power to send the military after civilians. This is an incredible threat to our nation, to the entire vision of our Constitution, to the entire platform on which our freedom exists. So I'm ringing the alarm bells tonight about this risk. If you remove a clear standard as to whether there is a rebellion and just say a president can deploy the military on a whim in places he doesn't like against peaceful protesters to distract Americans or to exercise a suppression of dissent, then you have flung the doors open to tyranny, to a strongman state, to authoritarian rule. And I don't believe there's a single senator here in the United States Senate who wants to see freedom crushed and authoritarian rule established here in the United States of America. Our founders did not want the president to be a king. A king can decide on a whim to deploy troops against his own people. Presidents cannot. During the debate at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, James Madison warned the following, quote, "A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty." Our founders were terrified that a president would employ a standing military against the citizens, and they would lose the entire vision of our Constitution. It would slide into being an authoritarian state if that were permitted. That's why I'm ringing the alarm bells. Because what's going on right at this moment is the President of the United States is an overgrown executive. That is, an executive seeking authoritarian power. And as Madison said, if such an executive starts using a standing military force, not long will we have our liberty. He noted in further commentary, the means of defense against foreign danger, that is, standing armies providing defense against foreign danger, have always been instruments of tyranny at home. That's why our founders were afraid of having a standing army. That's why we have the posse comitatus law, which says you can't deploy the military against civilians in the United States. That's why we have Title 10 that says you can only federalize federal forces, National Guard, if there is a rebellion or an invasion. Trump's plan is to replace government by and for the people with government by and for the powerful. We saw it on day one when he was sworn in to being president of the United States, and because of the weather, the swearing in was moved into the rotunda down this hallway, halfway between this Senate chamber and the House chamber. I was sitting a couple rows back, not very far from the president, and as the events commenced, I thought, how interesting. He campaigned on helping families. And we know what the foundations for families are. The foundations for families are health care and affordable quality housing, a decent home and a decent community, and education and good paying jobs. Those are the foundations for a family to thrive. But as I looked at the President of the United States and the row of people right behind him, I didn't see any champions for housing. I didn't see any champions for health care. I didn't see any champions for education. But I'll tell you what I did see. I saw a row of billionaires. Mark Zuckerberg was standing there, and Jeff Bezos was standing there, and Elon Musk was standing there. It was Trump telling us right then, this is what I'm about. Government by and for the rich and powerful. Government by and for the billionaires. If you had any doubt about where things were headed at that moment, all you had to do was wait for Team Trump to work with the members of the majority in the House and the members of the majority here in the Senate to craft their main bill. Trump called it his big, beautiful bill. Many of us called it the big, ugly betrayal. Why would we call it a betrayal? Betrayal because Trump campaigned on saying he was going to help families. But this bill, it was all about helping the billionaires, the mega millionaires and billionaires across America. The vision of that bill, the big, ugly betrayal of America bill, was families lose and billionaires win. That should tell you that we are now under an authoritarian direction, because in a republic where there is government by and for the people, that is not the vision. It is not a vision of families lose, billionaires win. That's not what government by and for the people would produce. Government by and for the people would produce a different vision. Families thrive. And the affluent, the mega millionaires, the billionaires, they pay their fair share. Families thrive, and billionaires pay their fair share. That's a vision. Had that been in the bill, I wouldn't be standing here tonight ringing the alarm bells that we are an authoritarian takeover of our nation.